What's your 115?
It's more than what I thought.
Oh.
Hello and welcome to Free Together, Free Apart, Hacking Family Success. I'm Erik Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Center for Family Studies. And we are here to strengthen families using the knowledge of family systems. And I am really delighted with the conference we're going to have on October 8th and 9th. I think it's going to be a fascinating and inspiring interdisciplinary adventure. And I am so grateful that today we have our two guest scientists for that conference, Dr. Rael Cahn from the University of Southern California's Center for Mindfulness Science, and Dr. Fred Travis, a neuroscience from Maharishi International University. Welcome, Rael, and welcome, Fred.
Great to be here. Thank you.
How are things going in California, Rael? Are the children back in school?
It's Zoom school.
Is it Zoom school? Yeah.
Yeah. So things are still pretty slowed down and relatively isolated. Related to the COVID, especially now with the fires as well.
Yeah,
the air's pretty smoky throughout the state.
Yep. How long have you lived in California?
I've been kind of headquartered in California since 1999 when I came down for medical and graduate school at UC San Diego.
Okay. Rael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I've been spending the last week with Fred Travis's help reading the papers that, some of the papers that Dr. Cahn has been publishing now for decades on the neuroscience of consciousness that's associated with meditation practices. And Fred, how are you doing?
Great. We just had a delight.
Is the university off Zoom or on Zoom or?
We have a hybrid situation.
Okay.
That is, students can come to class with masks, socially distanced, or they can be synchronously online. We started off by everyone who came to start school in August. They were tested for COVID, and everyone was quarantined for 2 weeks. We had goodie bags for them. We had asana mats and exercise ropes and things, coloring books, things that they could do in their rooms. After the 2 weeks of quarantine, they were tested again. And then those that had no diagnoses were able to come to class if they wished. And some are coming to class, some are staying home.
So Dr. Cahn is a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. And Dr. Travis, a neuroscientist, both teach and research scientists. Is that right, Dr. Cahn? Are you teaching also?
Yeah, although my teaching is primarily clinical teaching in the psychiatry emergency room at LA County Hospital. So teaching both the residents and the medical students. I do some teaching in psychology and neuroscience as kind of a guest lecturer for some courses on the main campus or even on the medical campus, but those are more sporadic. My primary responsibilities really are doing the clinical work and teaching on the job in the emergency room, and then my research.
So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I spent the first 15 years of my career dealing with a lot of crisis and know the emergency system in Vermont well. The last 15 years I've been working with executives and their leadership teams using this family systems model. But I was interested in that you really have been really in the trenches there at, I imagine, the LA County psychiatric emergency hospital is a pretty lively place. And
That's
I'm
correct.
curious, how do the ideas that you explore in your research land in a situation like that, in a psychiatric emergency situation?
Well, they certainly affect my viewpoint towards life generally, and that includes the kind of high pressure and intense psychiatric symptoms that we often see in the emergency room. We're seeing a lot of psychosis and
yes,
not kind of your everyday garden variety depression. Mostly if we see depression, which is the minority of what we see, but when we do see it, it's associated with a recent suicide attempt. And I think the main thing in terms of the viewpoint through which I really orient my research and the findings that I am in the process of uncovering and tracking what other people are doing, including Dr. Travis and others. It uncovers a sense of like bringing validity to the notion that our kind of isolated sense of self and identity as being really most appropriately identified with this body and this thinking mind and personality and story of just this one life is a limited perspective. It's not the full picture. And so, oftentimes in the psychiatric emergency, people are experiencing something like that. There's a real, dissipation of the ego structures, and it's, occurring in a way that's not very, very easy to handle for the individual and for their relationship with society. So, I think the one thing that my perspective really clearly and somewhat uniquely kind of brings to that situation is just, there's not so much pathologizing that I don't view that breakdown of their ego structure with the same degree of pathologizing that a lot of people might. Clearly, these psychiatric emergencies need help and kind of some containment, some help. Oftentimes the help is about getting people more grounded and less kind of identified with their dissipated ego structure. But, at the same time, I'm aware that, the manifestation of consciousness that is bringing people into those states is not necessarily more sick on a fundamental level than a lot of the everyday kind of states that people in our society are living in.
Wow, that's very interesting.
I just asked you a question, Rael. First, it's great to see you again.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoy
Good to
the
see you,
interactions. Yeah. That point about that they're living in a state which may not be different from other people who are not in the emergency room. What if you just unpack that a bit?
Well, so, I think in our society, we have many kind of sub-societies within our society. And there are some wonderful benefits and positives to that, and also some real problems that seem to be getting worse, although it's hard to know on an objective level. But regardless of that, there's a tendency for, in the main, for our kind of conception of who and what we are to be fairly limited to the notion that, we are not the same as others at the experiential level. You know, there's clear sense that, you know, I'm separate from you. And what happens in those extreme states oftentimes is people are experiencing a breakdown in that. They're no longer having that clear experiential sense that I am separate from you, or I'm different from you. And, you know, at a relative level, it's true. We are separate and different from each other. And then at a more kind of transcendental view, a more fundamental truth, I would say, is that actually that's a relative truth. And actually, when we can see things more clearly, we are aware that we are all one with each other. And so, you know, the view that people go through their life not questioning so much that, you know, we are fundamentally separate and need to kind of defend ourselves and fight for what we want to, you know, the exclusion of what others might want, is a very mixed up kind of lack of contact with a deeper reality. And it's quite predominant in modern society. And of course, you know, it's not so simple that that's the majority of what's happening. And there's so many wonderful currents of enlightened and compassionate thinking and ways of behaving that are taught throughout many both old and new developments in human culture. And nonetheless, though, you know, there is that sense that I think, you know, we as a human species are not yet living at a level of awareness where keeping that sense of like the transparency of self is not especially strong within our common cultural and social ways of relating to each other.
Is that because of our education and experience? I mean, everything you said, I completely agree with what you say, by the way, but everything you said, I don't think it's taught in school. There seems to be another, there needs to be some other formalized way to allow this worldview to be propagated.
Yeah, I agree very much. And, you know, I think it's certainly what brings me and a number of other people I know in both the clinical sciences and the neurosciences who are investigating the nature of consciousness, brings us to the effort is the sense that, you know, if we can more clearly understand the reality of how the mind and brain and body work, that understanding could be more widely propagated throughout society through education. And there are, of course, you know, religious traditions that contain different versions of partial and more and less partiality of these truths within them. But in terms of a world culture, you know, each individual religious tradition has this tendency to kind of exclude others who don't have the same kind of ways of thinking and languaging the distinctions. And so something that would be less tied to a particular individual teacher or particular, you know, cultural background that might have somewhat of a more scientific base to it, seems like it might be one of the keys to you know, having a body of knowledge that could be more widely taught and incorporated into our working models of how the world is.
I like to make some links between what we're hearing and Bowen theory, which also, by way of helping the audience on the call today to understand the aspiration of this conference on October 8th and 9th. So it's interesting that Murray Bowen's original research was on schizophrenia. And he was really trying to understand the way in which schizophrenia was not an individual brain, not just an individual brain phenomenon, but a systemic phenomenon. And actually the nature of a disease like schizophrenia, or really maybe all self-states of humans, is multi-generational and socially systemic. And so, he's trying to understand, and of course others along with him, colleagues like Gregory Bateson, trying to understand what is the nature of this human social system, what is the nature of the family system. And he comes out with this idea of differentiation of self, the idea that there's a variation in the qualities of self that exist within different systems. That self is not just a quality of individuals, it's a quality of systems. And that you could maybe try to map what are these differences. He came up with this fundamental idea of differentiation, which I am summarizing as healthy separateness in the title of the conference. Healthy separateness, a kind of separateness, a kind of organized separateness that is beneficial to the group, that leaves people feeling loved, loving, and also free, not trapped or embedded within the group consciousness of the system. And what emerges from that is a vision of a sort of aspirational, beautiful aspirational vision of how people could operate in families. Loved, loving, and free is a simple phrase to touch upon that. And I think it's a state of awareness, differentiation of self. It's attempting to describe a state of awareness. So many of those, the network who joins this call are going to be people who are familiar with Bowen theory. Most of the people at the conference will be drawn to it because they're part of the Bowen theory network. And they're fascinated by this state differentiation, a state of love, loving, and free, a state of highly connected, but also non-reactive to the intensity that might flash up and emerge and settle down going on between people. And that's viewed as a fundamental model of family leadership, which has a huge impact on, or is proposed to have a huge impact on, the level of chronic anxiety in the group. So what I think is fascinating is that these meditation traditions and they articulate a state of awareness that I think has lots of resonance with the way it's articulated in the Bowen theory. And also there's a tradition of respect for neuroscience in the Bowen theory. So this is why maybe you can see why I'm so happy that we have two neuroscientists coming to join in a conversation with other Bowen scholars, trying to explore what are higher stages of human development. And I know from reading Dr. Travis and Dr. Kahn's work, it's just an amazing record of decades of very careful study, along with your colleagues, of the neuroscientists trying to articulate and define physiologically higher stages of human development. And I think maybe both can learn from each other. I certainly feel that we in Bowen theory can learn a lot from the neuroscientific work that you've been doing, and also your understanding of meditation traditions. So I'm curious, I lay that out, and this is the first time we're talking. Maybe the audience, you can imagine, Fred and Rael and I are sitting at breakfast before the first meeting of the conference, which won't happen because of Zoom and COVID. And I would just wonder if either of you would like to comment on what I said. Does that make sense to you? What does it make you think about? Is it a wacky idea to start with and try to bring these things together? Is it a non-starter?
I'm still still thinking about the idea of the social self. And my focus is mainly on meditation experience and effect meditation practice. So it's more individual sense of self and how the individual sense of self can expand and grow and either be more or less differentiated from the environment, be more inclusive of things around us. So I was just trying to think about the social self and what's that interaction. So someone who individually, we could say their self is differentiated. That is, they're not tied to, identified with their actions, their thought. They have metacognitive abilities. They're open to other people's points of view. If that type of person goes into a social structure, a family, where the other individuals don't have that same perspective, what will happen? And will the other individuals look at that single individual as being mentally unstable and you're cold, you're not reactive, and so on. Those are some thoughts that were coming in my mind.
And then how, Fred, would that individual who has attained that de-embedded, did you say, can you phrase that again, de-embedded, how did you say that?
Where the individual is not completely lost and identified with their actions and their thoughts. So they're de-embedded. That is, they can reflect on what's going on. They can maintain paradox. They're comfortable with paradox. That with two people in the family can be completely different, and it's okay. And their differences makes up the wholeness of the family.
I would think they would be less threatened by the experience of being viewed as strange than somebody who had less of that characteristic in their consciousness.
I would think so. The whole point is the brain's a river and not a rock, so it's dynamically changing. And so a person who is very integrated goes into a family which is not integrated, which is not differentiated, wondering what's going to be the effect. Will that person just decide, I'm not going to visit my family very much? Is that person going to accept the state of interaction of their family members and try to help them, not in a therapeutic, I'm better than you sort of way, but more into you're the family and what do you think about this?
In the Bowen theory, there's a lot of discussion of family leadership, and it's there's a rich perspective of it's more how you're being with them, you know. And family leadership isn't always, is in fact very often not involved, not preoccupied with making other people change or think differently.
That's great. Expand that idea of being with them. That was a wonderful phrase.
I think this concept of differentiation of self is trying to describe a characteristic of presence. You can look at it as behavior, but I think it's all the behavioral descriptions are ultimately unsatisfying. It's people who write about it are trying to get at the idea of a certain kind of presence. Non-reactivity is a pretty good term. That less reactive to the emotional intensity in the group, more able to stay connected to it. But that's this idea of healthy separateness in the sense of less reactive. And I know that I was seeing that there's a deep exploration of non-reactivity in Dr. Cahn's work. Is that right? Dr. Cahn?
Yeah, that's right. I think just taking a step back before going into that a little bit, the different systems that have been developed over the decades, centuries, millennia to help optimize human consciousness and human flourishing, I think oftentimes do really come down to a pretty similar kind of bottom line goal or or a kind of ideal state that are being pointed to. So the state of being loved, loving, and what was the third aspect there with regards to love?
The third one is critical.
Yeah.
Free.
Loved, loving, and free.
Loved,
Yeah.
loving, and free.
Right. You know, I think that it would be pretty true to some of the meditative traditions that I've studied and worked with the long-term practitioners, you know, so looking at how their brain is changed through these practices. You know, it kind of captures an essential aspect of what those traditions are aiming to help people with as well. And the unique thing I think about the meditative traditions is that they tend to, as Fred's description of, you know, his focus of research kind of points towards, you know, they tend to be traditions that are aimed at helping the individual to attain some liberation within themselves. And of course, that's connected to the external world that individuals are embedded within, and that at some level, individuals are you know, just completely not separate from. But, you know, that I think there's that distinction with regards to the Bowen theory or other kind of more socially engaged theories and practices, which of course psychotherapies in general are all kind of a part of, you know, these kind of at least dyadic kind of explorations of meaning and emotional connection. And so the reactivity part, you know, I think using the tools of neuroscience, that is one of the easier things to assess, and certainly meditative practices do involve developing a great degree of internal awareness of, you know, what's happening moment to moment with regards to the field of sensation. And one aspect of, you could call sensation, certainly an aspect of quality of mind, is thinking process, but becoming more sensitive to, you know, that kind of ongoing narrative process that's happening throughout the life, which until one becomes reflective about it, it can just be kind of an automatic pilot. And then in enhancing the sensitivity and awareness of that whole field of moment-to-moment experience, also training oneself to be less automatically reactive about whatever comes up internally, which, you know, is the first step of processing of the external world, is, you know, having an internal impression about it. And so there are many markers of voluntarily reduced reactivity that I've seen in my work with meditation, and others have found as well. And, you know, I think the aspect that those of us who are really curious about meditation from the perspective of helping to optimize human functioning and human flourishing, societal flourishing, and kind of transformation of what we as humans are doing with each other and the world, is, you know, that interest is in the kind of loved and loving part, you know, the kind of freedom, the, you know, decrease of reactivity. It seems like meditative practices can do that for people. And what is a little less clear, and you know, may require some other forms of you know, interpersonal systems to transform and or replace the current set of interpersonal systems, the kind of loved and loving aspects. it is true that meditative practices can put one in touch, especially if you cultivate the kind of compassionate, loving kindness, intentionality, you can become quite aware of that. But that sense of really taking in the love around you and transmitting love to those around you, that I think all of us really want. Sometimes that is not really, I think there are things, interpersonal and intrapsychic kind of wounds that happen in the life of everyone, including those people who go on to meditate, that continue to be a challenge in that domain, in those domains. So I think it's just, for me, that's part of the interest in kind of taking part in this discussion, certainly to share some of what I have been learning, and both myself and the field as a whole about meditation and the brain, and the relationship with reactivity, self-related functioning, but also I'm curious about that exploration of what kind of systems can help with giving us all access to a greater sense of emotional, connective experience.
I think with Bowen theory, the senior practitioners learn to examine their subjective experience of any social group they're in where they're trying to solve a problem. So if you have a kid who's struggling, or a marriage, that's, at risk, the guidance is to really learn a lot about your subjectivity and try to understand how your subjectivity is part of the problem, is part of what's stimulating that imbalance in the system that leads to a symptom. So you're really trying to learn to not see the symptom and the asymptomatic individual as a sort of a disconnected from your own subjectivity.
Yeah.
And what you just spoke about, the practice of, if I was following you, learning to see your own subjectivity differently, in a fundamental different way. I think you've studied that.
Yeah.
Neurophysiologically, neuropsychologically.
Yeah.
And
I think a big part of it, when it comes
from that internal subjective narrative and seeing it more objectively. There's a lot of resonance there with the project of family leadership.
Yeah.
As it's defined in Bowen theory.
Yeah, I think that captures well what there's a commonality across a number of meditative traditions, and I don't know that Fred, maybe you can discuss whether that seems to ring true within the TM practice as well, but the becoming familiar with the internal world of experience in an impersonal way, kind of depersonalizing, recognizing this voice, it just keeps going. It doesn't even seem to be at my beck and call. and the kind of loops of kind of stimulus response and reactivity, they don't seem to be all that much related to something deeply, me in any deep way. It's just this kind of conditioning. And so, one becomes kind of aware of, how to attend in a relatively calm and clear, unflappable way with the whole realm of the internal sensations and thinking process.
And that sounds to me like the development of a different kind of self.
Right.
Where self is not so identified with one's own subjective experiences, which again, I think is highly relevant for family leadership, because if you look at a couple, a married couple, the problem is usually not that they have nothing in common. Often they have children in common who are the most important people in their lives. The problem is more how attached they become to their subjectivity about each other, how stuck in those subjective reactions they are, so that, you know, they've lost contact with thinking processes that could correct the problem in the marriage. So yeah, I like to ask you, Fred, you know, and I'm going to make a little attempt to link over to Fred's work, which is, I heard Rael on a video talking about research you've done on narrative-free states of awareness. And I think with TM, you're cultivating this inner silence, a self-experience that is separate from all the reactions you have to the world, the outside world. And so you're developing a kind of, as you wrote in very clearly in one of your research papers, a sense of self that's de-embedded from objects of experience. And I'm kind of interested in the links between that and this non-narrative or narrative-free awareness, and the kind of self that we talk about in Bowen theory, where, like I was just trying to describe, you become less embedded in your subjective experiences of other people, important people in your life.
This is a great area to discuss. And I'd like to just put it in the context that the meditation experiences across the board, I think, have allowed this type of discussion to come forth. I would venture to say, Rael, that you did not have your viewpoint on what clinical emergency room psychiatric cases are if it wasn't from your meditation experience. That gave you an experience of something outside of people thinking and acting and behaving, something much larger than the self. But the way I understand this is very simply, with every experience, there's us, the knower, there's the object, and then there's a process which connects us with the knower. And how I understand what you're saying, Rael, is you're very much involved in that processing. Okay, how am I related to, affected by this? And then you don't identify with that. You're looking more at the process, which is connecting you with whatever is the experience, the thinking, the emotion. And how you see what transcendental meditation is doing is allowing you to transcend even that process. So it is narrative free, but it's not narrative free in terms of lack of activity. It's that narrative has no meaning. It doesn't exist. It is as if a wave can be very quiet on the surface of the ocean, and that's narrative free. Or the wave could identify with the ocean itself. And I think it's that experience which, when the person then goes back into activity, they're able to see their habits, their prior concepts, their prior relationships in a different way. It's not so much a intellective exercise that needs to be involved in. It's more that the light of self is just different. It's stronger, it's fuller. It's going through the same habits, the same structures of mind, the same structures of senses, but somehow that light is different. And that can help transform. It can help free you from ongoing activity because you're not completely lost in it. You're as a step back a bit, and there's a wider range of the field of experience that's in your awareness. You're not just lost in the train of thinking, or have to be moment by moment aware of the train of thinking. It's something even before all of that. In general, I see that the experience of transcending is fundamental to changing the individual. And then what you're talking about in terms of culturing reactivity and emotional regulation like that is very important to use as tools. But I see that it'd be most effective if the self, himself or herself, is more expanded and free and self-sufficient and outside of ongoing change.
I'm watching our time and where we've got about 20 minutes left, and I just I'm pleased we're kind of warming up and preparing this conversation. And at the conference, we're going to have the opportunity to hear a little more fully from each of our presenters, their basic ideas, but also a lot of time for this kind of interactive exploration of the nuances of these three bodies of knowledge, or, you know, maybe it's more than three. Not trying to force them together, but rather let them learn from each other, let them benefit from each other. And one thing I just want to do, to pause for a sec, is to show the audience, just to talk about the conference a little bit more now, and then perhaps give audience members a chance, if you'd like to, make a comment or ask a question that's on your mind about this topic. But just to tell you a little bit more about the conference, I'm going to show you the topics, the title topics of our group of presenters here. And you can see our group of presenters includes Amy Post, who's a faculty member of the Bowen Center. She tells really good stories about this fascinating idea of differentiation of self. I have just benefited so much from her stories. I'm really glad to have her back again this year. We have Suzanne Brew, who's a longtime Bowen thinker, who's going to talk about the mother and what we can learn from ancient wisdom traditions about the mother. And we also have Leslie Fox, another person who's exploring the relationship between differentiation and meditation. And Mark Roberts, one of these non-academic, long-term meditators whose research on the self is really quite fascinating. And so, again, these are the talk titles that we have lined up. I'm just going to let the audience see these and read these.
This looks great. Leslie, I look forward to hearing your talk.
This is someone who's, you know, a faculty member teaching Bowen theory, who is on a journey of learning about meditation and reflecting on the connections. I thought this title, Meditation and the Transformation of Self-Related Brain Processes, is very intriguing from a Bowen theory perspective, where we talk a lot about self. What does it mean to be a self in the system? What is the neuroscience of self? And what can we learn about being a self in the system from it? Again, Amy Post, a very good storyteller.
Could you tell me a little more of Suzanne's background?
She's just somebody with years of background in Bowen theory, teaching it, living it, studying it, lifelong student, done a lot of professional presentations in the Bowen network. And she's gone on a journey to understand, you know, Bowen was interested in this question of, well, what is an awesome mother? What kind of a mother functions in a way that it would be unlikely for members of the group to get symptoms, or if they did have symptoms, her response to it wouldn't make them worse. And Suzanne Brew has gone into ancient wisdom traditions with that fund of knowledge about what Bowen said about it, and found some really wonderful pearls that are there in these traditions describing this kind of mother and what they would act like.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. Now, and I did want to mention also that just for trying to promote the conference and the For people on this call who want to register for the conference, we're going to send you a link that you can register for a $50 discount if you register before Friday. So the link will allow you to go into the registration page and do that. I see we have, okay, I have a question from Dave Galloway in Vancouver. This is an international call. If meditating literally changes my physiology such that I am less reactive in relationships, would this mean I've gained a bit of greater differentiation of self?
I would think so. Rael, what's your feeling?
I think, yeah, you know, it's the unpacking of the notion of differentiation of self that I think that this question points to, which I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that, Fred. But in general, I do think that both the predicate is accurate. You know, people who undergo meditation in a way that is, you know, true to the intention with regards to these teachings. There are ways of, you know, getting into meditation where without guidance, or you can kind of just be tuning out, you know, certain aspects of certain opennesses to the self and to the world. But, you know, the intention is really to open up, and that when you go through practice for a sustained period, and that we know that does tend to change physiology in a way that, you know, one becomes less reactive, maybe first to more superficial things, like, you know, an annoying encounter at the coffee shop, but eventually also it kind of deepens into, even with really deeply triggering dynamics related to attachment figures and, you know, those people who are most close to, and therefore allow ourselves, you know, to express our kind of deeper, darker aspects of interpersonal discomforts, and you know, ultimately you could say it all comes down to, you know, all of our pathology is all a pathology of self, and it's just being out, you know, expressed in relationship to others, because that's the way that the world is ordered in the, you know, the kind of occurring of the world. We seem to be surrounded by others all the time. And when that happens, you know, that there's an increased differentiation of self that has occurred. I think the reason I say that really calls for some discussion about the differentiation of self is, you could also conceptualize it as it's a, you know, an integration of self that's occurred. And so talking about integration versus differentiation of self, I think it's a kind of a nuanced discussion.
That's such a great point you finished with, Rael. I think they're really two sides of the same coin. Differentiation is the first step to lead to a higher level of integration. And it's a continual step. That's what life is all about. We continually de-embed for our current level of seeing and interacting with the world, and we integrate at a more comprehensive level, a more global level. It's a great point.
Word
David.
integration is one that appears in Bowen theory discussions in terms of the integration of the feeling and the thinking system of the brain. And one thing that's common to Bowen theory and the work you both have done is the understanding that consciousness and self states have a neurophysiological correlate, or, you know, that these things are inextricably linked. There's a lot of active debate in the Bowen theory world as to whether meditation could actually grow differentiation of the self as it's defined in Bowen theory. And this is one of the other agendas I have for this conference, is to explore that possibility in a disciplined way, not to just assume yes, but to explore it in a disciplined way, because it's very important that I think that we are open to finding new ways to grow the self and to grow the capacity to be a family leader as it's defined in Bowen theory. So let me see, I've got a few more questions. Oh, Dave, would you like to unmute and just say your, and while Dave is doing that, I want to invite others who are on the call. If you have a question, we're probably just going to have time for one, maybe two more questions.
For the training course that I do in Vancouver that I attend, I did a paper on mindfulness a number of years ago. I'm going to dig it back out, but I do think there's a notion of if you think you've identified the problem person and you tell them to go meditate, I think of that as a cause-effect individual model. So there's that issue. But my personal experience, having been meditating for decades, is that and that's why I mentioned the word physiology. Mm-hmm. So to me, if a person's more differentiated, it's going to show in their physiology. And so if I'm getting my physiology to show up that way with a different method, do we care? A calmer physiology is a calmer physiology. And I'll take it any way I can get it. And I'll let somebody else ask the question. Thanks.
Dave, I'm glad you put in this humorous and certainly ubiquitous idea that could someone get them to meditate? Could someone get this person in my family to meditate? Maybe we could sell a lot of seats at the conference if we said we're going to have a talk on how to get your family member to meditate. But both Bowen theory and I think many wisdom traditions would point to this idea that you seem to be suggesting as well. How about if you learn to meditate and see if it changes the way you interact with that person whose behavior you're preoccupied with changing?
An example, Dave, of a differentiated physiology, this is a transcendental meditation practice. What happens over time is sympathetic tone. So how the fight or flight system, how active it is lower in terms of a baseline, but you react more quickly when there's a threatening stimuli or meaningful stimuli, but then you come back to rest again. So what you have, what is, I think, a differentiated physiology is one that's adaptable, that it's able to have a wider range of functioning, and it moves through that wider range without any jerks and jolts and so on, or smoothly.
That matches up well with what I have both seen in some of my own work and in the work exploring some of the other meditative traditions outside of TM. Yeah.
Great.
Can you say more about this interesting term, sympathetic tone? What is that?
Go ahead.
So there are basically two major drivers of how the body automatically maintains itself. One is to ramp up resources. That's the sympathetic nervous system. The other is to restore. It's called the parasympathetic nervous system. And whenever we're in a threatening situation, also interesting enough, a novel or meaningful stimulation situation, there's a ramping up of resources. Sensory areas are more acute, breath is faster, heart is faster, muscle tone is tight. It's to ramp up resources to deal with a situation. What happens under chronic low-grade stress is the sympathetic tone is just always high. Even though you don't have to be on guard, you could just be more settled and enjoying what's around you. And so that's sympathetic tone itself. And that's one measure. The other measure is reactivity, because it's important to react. If right now a Zoom bomber came onto Zoom, it's important that we focus, we break
Mute 'em.
everything down, and we start again.
That's my job, to mute them.
Exactly. But then once it happens, you should go back to rest again. So this is the idea. The sympathetic nervous system is a resource allocation system. It's there to keep us safe. And in our very fast-paced, high-stress world, it's become triggered on a bit. Want to add to that, Rael? Stuck on, yeah.
Stuck on.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is that, you know, that in relationship to the functional adaptivity of having the sympathetic nervous system kind of shift on quickly when needed, and also dissipate in its activation as quickly as possible, that's tied also to some other kind of underlying neurophysiologic mechanisms of perceptual acuity. So, you know, there's evidence with meditation, not just that, you know, you become more easily able to, you know, pick up on discordant and or unexpected conditions in the environment and quickly respond appropriately, but also even to picking up the fact that something is occurring that, you know, might actually pass under awareness normally. So there's a relationship there too, you know, in terms of at the neurochemical level between the fundamental mechanisms that mediate the awareness of sensory events, which is partly mediated through some of the same neurotransmitters that at a more widespread body-based level, you know, become released when the sympathetic nervous system is engaged. So, you know, both the more subtle level of just becoming more alert to, aware of what's occurring in the world, as well as, you know, actually marshaling the resources to respond to it. I see both of those things, which are, you know, it's just different from the kind of old-fashioned view of what meditation might be doing, of just kind of, you know, putting you in this relaxed state where everything's okay. You know? It's not that simple, you know. There's much more of a kind of process of energizing the nervous system, essentially.
Yeah, sounds like a more fundamental and nuanced transformation of threat response that you both are talking about, where you're accurately responding to what you need to be responding to, but not caught in a chronic reactivity towards things which are not really threatening day to day.
Right.
All right, so we're coming down to the end of our time today, and I just want to thank you both again for coming and giving folks a little bit of a preview of the depth of the neuroscience of the self and the stress reactivity that we're going to be exploring at the conference, and how it relates to Bowen theory. And that last piece, I mean, that it's just so resonant with the descriptions of what a differentiated family leader would be like, you know, that they would be more dynamically interacting with the real threats the family are facing, at the same time one of those voices in the room that can help everyone calm down about that which really isn't threatening. And it sounds like sympathetic tone is part of the neurophysiology of differentiation, and that there's good evidence that this is affected by meditation. Now, that's something I've seen in both your work, that this ability to just document what do we know from science about the power or the possibility of meditation affecting things at this deep of a level. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
I'm looking forward for October too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rael, for connecting. And I look forward to speaking with you more in October.
Likewise, yeah.
So once again, it's October 8th and 9th. If you register before Friday, you can get a discount. We'll send you a link to help you do that. And finally, just next week, I will be back here with my colleague from the Vermont Center for Family Studies, Cami Kelton. It's next Thursday at our normal time, 2 o'clock, and we will explore more of what the heck was going on in my head when I thought of creating and organizing this conference. Have a very good afternoon, Rael. Thank you so much.
Too.
And Fred,
Thank
take
you,
care.
Erik. All the best. Bye.
Adios. Bye-bye.